I think I have them, Ashley.
Great. Can you change your slides? That's the next question.
There we go.
Okay, great.
Excellent.
Okay. All right. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, and give you a little bit of background on IVM Partners. Formed that in 2003. I was part of a vegetation management task force with Edison Electric Institute, and we were trying to come up with a what we have now an IVM, accepted IVM practice, but we really weren't getting anywhere. So I had talked to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and basically came up with a nonprofit that could try to meet both sides of the equation and be a liaison between industry and the agencies and the conservation groups to do research and inform and educate the managers as to what really works and develop partnerships between them. Because I feel like we're wasting so much opportunity. If you look at how many acres there are that are in rights-of-way, that we could really be improving habitat and bringing back vegetation that different types of wildlife need. So that's what we started. And use this cursor. And I want to get into what we're finding on some of the research, that if you see a utility put in a new line, or in the case here on the left is a new natural gas pipeline, what normally happens is everybody does deep clearing, takes out the roots, mixes up the soil profiles, and then they have to plant something, which they're usually introducing something like orchard grass or Lespedeza or something like that. You're also hearing on trying to improve habitat for the monarch butterfly. There's a candidate conservation agreement with assurances that was negotiated with the right-of-way habitat working group out of the University of Illinois, Chicago, with Fish and Wildlife Service. But when you talk about planting, to have a successful planting like you see here on the right for the monarch, you're going to spend about $10,000 an acre, which is not really feasible on an entire right-of-way. So I want to give an example of bringing back some rare species simply by changing on what type of practices we do when we do our construction. This is a partnership we put together with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and TransCanada Natural Gas. And this is a site at Canaan Valley National Wildlife Refuge in West Virginia. And they had a rare sedge. And in my discussions with them, I said, well, instead of them making them plant, the seeds of this sedge, which is an annual plant, are in the soil, the topsoil. So scrape off the topsoil and isolate it, which they did their construction where they're mixing up the soil. And then when they're done, they just spread that topsoil back, and it came back just like it was. The benefit here that we didn't have to worry about erosion because we're at the bottom of a valley, so it couldn't really go anywhere. But if you needed to do something, you could put mulch down without having to plant and introduce a species that may become, not necessarily that it's a non-native, but it could be a native but become invasive simply by dominating that plant community. Okay, there we go. So what we've done with case studies is we're not just looking at electric or gas, just the utilities, but we're also working with the public agencies on highways because a right-of-way is a right-of-way. You have different objectives, but to meet those objectives, you need to manage the vegetation. So we've done documentation around the country, and one here with Maryland Department of Transportation. University of Maryland had a grant to help improve pollinator habitat, and they were going to plant. And in this case here, I said, why don't you just stop mowing? Let's see what you get. So on the left, you see what it looked like. This is near Frederick, Maryland, which is the center of Maryland. And on the right is what came in that first growing season. There's 51 different species of plants. Now you have tall grown trees, which you don't want by a highway, and you also have invasive plants. So what we did was come in after one growing season and do a selective backpack treatment with herbicides to take out the invasive plants and the tall trees and not touch the pollinator plants. So they ended up restoring pollinator habitat without the expense of planting anything, just adopting an integrated approach. This is another highway study we did with Alabama DOT. This is near Talladega. And the highway departments divide their right-of-way into zones. Zone 1 is right next to the road surface, which you normally will see them mowing that. They want that in grass. Zone 2 is where they have their drainage. There's usually a swale or a ditch to take the drainage. And then zone 3 is the back slope. A lot of the highway departments will mow that entire area, which might be 150 feet wide on an interstate, simply because the state owns the land. And what we did was say, look, mow the part you need to, zone 1, and let's do selective treatments on the back slope where you don't really have to mow. And this is what the documentation showed. One herbicide treatment in 2015 resulted in 21 new species of plants germinating from 2015 to 2018. And in 2018, we touched up with another herbicide application. So we're controlling things. In this case, they had invasion of Chinese privet as a shrub, and they had a lot of Johnstone grass. We controlled those invasive plants, and simply by doing that, we ended up with another 21 species. And you can see the breakdown, and the colors will give you, the herbaceous plants, which are going to be your flowering plants, and then the green is your grasses. We did the same thing with Florida DOT. This is near Lake City, Florida. And again, this is the backslope area. You see the electric 69 kV line on the left. And we just said, just stop mowing. And they stopped mowing. We didn't even need to do a treatment yet because nothing came in that was really offensive. And they're saving $500 an acre not mowing. So why do that additional expense if you don't have to? See what will come in. Now mowing, most utilities are used to mowing, and then it's an accepted practice. But when you're looking environmentally, it's not the best thing. John mentioned about mastication, and you are really chopping everything up, and you're down to basically mulch when you're done. But there are issues with mowing, such as erosion. You take all the vegetation off at the wrong time of year, then you have nothing to protect it, particularly this time of year where we're getting tropical storms. A lot of the thunderstorms now, you're dumping, 2 to 5 inches of rain. And if you just took everything off with a mower, you can expect you're going to have erosion and sedimentation of streams. You also hear everybody talking about climate change. What is your carbon footprint? If you're doing routine mowing, you're burning hydrocarbons every time. You are not going to reduce your carbon footprint. So when you get where oftentimes people are afraid of herbicides, and they'll take that lumped in term of pesticide and make it sound like it's bad. But you have to weigh these things against each other and say, what's the pros and cons of each factor? Especially when you cut, and again, John mentioned this, you cut the tree, you didn't do anything to that root system. It's coming back, and it'll come back with a vengeance. A lot of these trees will just send multiple sprouts where you had one stem, now you might have 20, or if you had a root suckering plant such as Tree of Heaven, you might have 100 trees next year, and they're going to grow very quickly. The other problem with mowing, and not everybody I think abides by this, but you need to, because the Migratory Bird Act, you're not supposed to be doing brush hog mowing between April and August when the songbirds are nesting. So when you get to this time of year, late August, everybody starts mowing. But in late August into October is when a lot of the flowering species, especially the aster family, such as goldenrod, are going to be blooming. And these are what the pollinators need. Now, I've had discussions with Fish and Wildlife where they worry about milkweed for the monarch, but the monarch needs to make a 3,000-mile migration from the upper Midwest to Mexico for the eastern population. Fish and Wildlife is going to be deciding this December whether or not to list the monarch as a threatened and endangered species. So, and we've already had the rusty patch bumblebee listed, which didn't affect too many utilities because it's kind of an isolated, but something like the monarch is ubiquitous around the country. So you could end up with some restrictions. And the very simple thing is leave these plants to grow this time of year and wait to mow it in November. These plants will be done. The monarch will be back into its overwintering sites, either in Mexico or in California. Now, I mentioned the zones for highways, and one of the best practices that Dr. Bramble and Burns researched at State Game Land 33 in Pennsylvania is to develop a wire zone under the conductors where you want access and you don't want anything that could grow up into the conductors and violate FAC 003. But you could have a border zone off to the side where you allow shrubs to come in that are not going to impact the electric, but provide better habitat for pollinators and other wildlife. We did this on a study in Michigan. When the trees were cleared to get in compliance with FAC, we came in and did a treatment down the wire zone, and this is a broadcast treatment, meaning we're going to spray the entire section using an ATV with two sprayers on it. And we're spraying herbicides that will select for grasses. So this is a Garlon Tordon. You could also use Garlon and Escort, but we're basically taking out forbs, your flowering plants, and trying to get grasses to grow in that section for access and to not have any violations. On the sides of the right-of-way, we did selective backpack treatments. So in this case, they're touching it up, and here we used a herbicide that Bayer has called Method, minocyclopyrachlor, and that's combined with Arsenal. So we're trying to bring in the flowering plants, and when you see what comes in, you can see the grasses on the left and flowering plants on the right. We developed a pollinator site value index that came from research that Dr. Peter Littner did at the University of Delaware. And what we're looking at is the value of the pollen that flower is producing, the nectar that it's producing, the number of beneficial species, overwintering and breeding habitats, such as hollow stems that insects will bore into and overwinter. And then what flowering months do we have for that particular section of the country? So we combine that, and that way we're doing a side-by-side comparison as what type of plants we get based on how beneficial it is to the pollinator. In this case, we're looking at the bumblebee, Bombus, and the honeybee, which is Apis. A lot of people talk about the honeybee because you have people who have beehives, and they're much needed for almonds and blueberries and a lot of plants that they bring these hives all over the country. But those who are really looking at the natural areas are more concerned with the bumblebees because that's our native bees, and there's a lot of diversity across the country. But our pollinator index, we can do either one because certain plants the bumblebee can feed on that the honeybee can't, such as mountain laurel. Their proboscis, how they feed is different. But anyway, we took these different metrics, and we have a maximum that if everything was perfect, what you could have would be a total of 1,200. But we looked at what it was as a baseline, and then what was the difference between the wire zone and the border zone. And so when you look at it, the baseline was in 2006. The green is the wire zone, which is the grasses. The blue is the border zone where we have more flowering plants, the herbaceous plants. And so you could see that by what type of herbicide we choose and what application technique we choose, we can determine pretty well what type of plant community will come back. And so if you want pollinators, you shouldn't use a broad spectrum that will take out flowering plants of something like garland and tordon everywhere. You can be selective with it, but you shouldn't do it as a broadcast if you want to have pollinators. And as an example, I did training a few years ago in Indiana, and the federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as the Forest Service, wanted pollinator plants, and it was an electric cooperative. And they had a program of every 4 years, they would side trim the trees next to the electric lines and herbicide treat the floor of the right-of-way at the same time. And I said, that's a good program. I said, but you're using garland and tordon, aren't you? And they said, yeah, how do you know? And I said, because you have nothing but grass. You could still do what you're doing, but switch herbicides to allow the pollinator plants to come in. And that way you're meeting the objective of electric reliability and access, and at the same time, meeting the objective of that federal agency wanting pollinator plants. So sometimes what we do, we can form partnerships with agencies and conservationists simply by changing the objectives to meet not only our primary objective, but also the secondary objectives of the other agencies. And here's a case in Maryland with, we work with Baltimore Gas and Electric. And on the left, you can see what the right-of-way looked like when it was mowed. On the right is with selective treatments, so that we basically brought back what was the native prairie of the mid-Atlantic states. And we put on a field tour for the agencies, and one of the agencies, U.S. Geological Survey, is a nationally recognized bee expert, Sam Droege, and he told the attendees, this is probably the best pollinator habitat in the mid-Atlantic. And this particular right-of-way, you're looking at a 2-year conversion. It was mowed. When it sprouted back, we did the herbicide treatments, and what you see on the right is what came in naturally. That was so successful that U.S. Fish and Wildlife asked us to do the same thing at Patuxent National Wildlife Refuge outside of Washington, D.C. And they had a big problem with autumn olive, which is an invasive shrub, and Bradford pear, Callery pear, which has exploded in invasiveness in the mid-Atlantic. But Fish and Wildlife said, can you do it without mowing? Because we don't want the mastication of all the vegetation out here. We said we can do it, but we have to equip tractors with sprayers to get over the top of the trees. So we did the treatment in 2011. You see the results in 2012. Then we touched it up with backpacks. And here you can see how the invasive plants are in red and how they're basically knocked out. And the grasses and the forbs, we combined them here because that's what we were trying to get back. And this is what it looked like 4 years later. So you're back to prairie grass. In the foreground there, you can see milkweed. And so we're bringing back milkweed for the monarch without planting anything. So when you graph this on the pollinator index, you could see that we improved it 10 times what was there before for bumblebees and honeybees, simply by doing the proper herbicide application at the right time and with the right chemistry. So I always tell people when they say, well, you know, we don't want to use any herbicides. And I say, I kind of look at it no difference than if you really have a sickness. And I've had Lyme disease, being out in the woods a lot as a forester. With Lyme disease, I had to take antibiotics for a couple of weeks to knock it out. And then, you know, now if I have a headache or something or a muscle ache, I might take an Advil or a Tylenol or an aspirin. I don't have to keep taking an antibiotic. So when your right-of-way is basically sick, then you need the herbicides to knock out these invasive plants. You can target the certain species by the type of chemistry you use. You can use different techniques depending on the height and the density. And when you get rid of these weed plants, that allows our native grasses and wildflowers to come back. And then once they come back, they help keep that area in good vegetation because they compete with the other plants. They produce, a lot of them produce their own chemicals as herbicides called allelopathic chemicals. And then animals will feed on the voles and field mice will feed on the seeds and the plants, which is another study Bramble and Burns did. So to show you how that changes, this is a right-of-way outside of Nashville, Tennessee. It was, that area is controlled by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a hydro dam, J. Percy Priest Lake, for those who know Nashville. And when I explained to the Army Corps what we wanted to do and how we were going to do it, they said, well, that'll improve our goal of providing wildlife management. So you're looking here at a 3-year difference from trees to low-growing plants. Again, milkweed came in naturally. And we had so many butterflies in here that we had a field tour, again, for the Army Corps and utilities in the area of Nashville. So if you put that on the pollinator index, you can see not only did we provide the habitat, but about every 3 to 4 years, we touch up with backpacks, and you've got consistently better habitat for pollinators. And this is, we're looking at a 10-year period here. Now, a lot of the utilities will say, we'll have to mow it to get in and do, particularly for gas, cathodic testing, regular maintenance. And so instead of mowing the entire right-of-way, we said, well, let's use something like Garland and Tordon or Garland and Escort, about 15 feet wide, right where the pipe is. And then we can develop a pipe zone, border zone, similar to the electric, but in this case, a smaller section so that they can see from pipe marker to pipe marker. They can get in and do maintenance. And we have a grass lane with the forbs that grow taller in between the pipes. And for those who say, well, I don't really care about pollinators, the other aspect of that is when you have more pollinator type of insects, I mean, you have the pollinator plants, that invites the insects. Those insects are what wild turkeys and quail are going to be feeding on. So you're providing wildlife habitat at the same time you're providing pollinator habitat. Now, the other thing that and I've mentioned this to John about additional research in Ashley that we need to do. When we put in a right-of-way, oftentimes you have to do mitigation. You might have to do 3 acres of some sort of mitigation for 1 acre cleared. And that, I think, gets into where we did it the old way of tearing everything out in the roots and then planting things that are not beneficial. This is a case we're doing in Oklahoma right now. In 2019, it had regrown back to scrub oak type of habitat of eastern Oklahoma. And it was an abandoned pipeline. So to reclaim it, I said, well, just clear it. So it was cleared this past winter, and you see what it looked like a few weeks ago on the right. And we, again, mapped that out according to the types of plants. And you could see that when it was in the woods, almost half of the ground cover was leaf litter. There was nothing, can't grow into the shade. We cut it, and you could see the herbaceous plants doubled. Now, you don't reduce the trees. You notice they're almost the same percentage of ground cover are tree species. And that, again, gets to when you cut down trees, the roots are still there. So now we'll follow up with herbicide treatment and see if it won't expand on the beneficial type of plant community, which we definitely believe it will. We've done it everywhere else. Here's another one that was in Arkansas. They thought this was in the National Forest, so they were constantly mowing it, and then they discovered that the National Forest boundary was farther up the mountain, so it was herbicide treated. And again, this is not done because they don't have the permit from U.S. Fish and, or U.S. Forest Service to do the herbicides. Hold on a minute. There we go. So you see when it was mowed in the fall of 2013, then it was mowed again in 18. But you could see how the plant community changes from a mowing practice. The trees get more dense and taller, and it basically pushes out the pollinator plants. And one herbicide treatment in 2019 gave you the results you see in 2020. So the data is there to show, you know, kind of similar to what John's talking about. What's the economics of these? What's the fate and effect of the chemicals? But this is kind of looking at what's the fate and effect of the habitat when you do proper management. Now, I do want to mention, this is particularly those out in the western states. California, you know, it's burning at record acreage right now, following up a bad year last year. So when you're doing rights-of-ways in the western states, definitely need to get rid of ladder fuels that can carry fire. But we also did another comparison here next to the National Forest in Arizona, where we couldn't use herbicides. It was cut, and it's a longer cycle in the high desert simply because you don't have the rainfall. And then we did a herbicide treatment on one side, on the right. The left side had to be recut in 2014. The herbicide treatment side, we didn't need to do anything else. We released grasses, which was better rangeland for the ranchers, so they were happy for their cattle and sheep. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see where we have cliff rose, as well as all these pollinator plants coming in. The right-of-way also can be, now because it's low-growing, cool-burning plants, it is not going to carry fire very well. And Derek is speaking next, and he'll talk about some of the invasive grasses, such as cheatgrass. But when you get a right-of-way like this, now you have an area that the hotshot crews can have some relative safety of coming into a right-of-way and use the right-of-ways to backfire and stop wildfires from going right across and taking out all the communities. So your rights-of-way can also be beneficial for those purposes. So just to summarize, on when you're looking at mowing or hand cutting, you can only maintain the vegetation. You can't really change it. You spread the invasive plants with cutting. You have to use herbicides to reclaim and restore the habitat by getting rid of the problem species. We have found all across the country, you don't need to plant. The native stuff is there. You know, God put it there a long time ago. All we're doing is letting it come back. If you look at most of the forests that we have, they're not any more than 100 years old. And if you look back into the 1920s, those were probably pastures and areas that were farmed. So the plants are still there. They just need an opportunity for these nectar and pollen plants to come back, which is what we need for bees, for butterflies. These animals and plants provide biological control. It is going to save money, and we can do it in all types of management. We've got studies going on in Maryland where we're doing it on farms. We're doing some on golf courses as well as the highways. I do want to thank Bear, because Bear has been a major supporter of our studies around the country. And I invite you to join us and, you know, put partnerships together with the different agencies. We can document the plant diversity based on your techniques and how does it benefit a wide variety of animals and plants. Collaborate with the universities and conservationists. One of our goals is to develop a college curriculum so the universities actually start to teach integrated vegetation management as a science. And again, we're going to have a lot of the studies on our website, and there's my contact information, and I'll turn it back over to John and Ashley. Thank you.
Hey, Rick, before we move on, you do have a question in the chat box, and from Tim Lohner, is there any evidence that species recovered from the seed bank are better able to inhibit tree establishment than species in a new seed mix? Won't tree seeds be in the seed bank as well?
I think we would have to do more studies to definitively say one way or the other. It really depends on what's in the seed bank.
Yeah.
Some areas come back really well. I know that when they do the mowing and we have a lot of wood chips, if they're allowed to get any deeper than 2 to 4 inches, those wood chips are going to inhibit the seed bank. But where they have a chance to come in, I think the benefit that we're seeing is that it's the plants coming in that are native to that area rather than us introducing something. we have another study in West Virginia where we're looking at a brand new pipeline and comparing areas that were cleared for the pipeline but not planted against those that were planted. And we're working with the Department of Natural Resources on kind of revising what the seed mix should be and to take into account what's native to that area instead of us introducing the same plants everywhere when we do a seed mix. But I can't really say everywhere that you're definitely going to get what you want. But my point is, let's give it a chance. When I was a forester at Delmarva Power on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, we cleared, and I told the construction crews, I said, just back slope with the backblade it with the bulldozers when you got done putting that pipe in. Get rid of your ruts. Let's see what we get. And we ended up bringing back rare orchids popped up that need disturbance. So it's interesting what comes in if you let it. And I think we need to talk more with the agencies and say, let us see what comes in naturally. And if it doesn't come in, we can supplement rather than immediately coming in with a seed mix that's costly, that, you know, we're introducing species that may or may not be native to that particular area of the country.
Thanks, Rick.
Any other questions? I don't see the chat, what's coming in, so I don't know what oh, there.
That's all right. That's why I was helping.
We also had a question that said, can you post the study about the pollinator site value index?
Yes, actually, we have some of that on the website. We published a paper at the International Right-of-Way Symposium on that index. And we're expanding it right now. We're developing a biodiversity index. Rather than just looking at pollinators, we're looking at what else comes in that's beneficial on biodiversity. Again, so we can work with agencies and say, look, don't force us to do things and make it, you know, one size fits all. Let's work with what nature has given us and then go from there. But it is published, and if it's not on our, I'm pretty sure it's on the, yeah, it's on our website. In fact, I have a link for all of the papers in the Right-of-Way Symposium, which used to be published by EPRI a few years ago.
Right.
But I have them all because we've had papers in those symposiums since 1993 when the meeting was in Montreal. So our papers are all in there, and they're on our website.
Very good, Rick. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Hey, and Derek.
Hey, John, we had one more question in the Q&A. That's okay. Yeah. I was watching the Q&A separate from the chat, and Toby was asking, have any agencies or states adopted the index? Because she's saying that several are coming up with their own scorecards.
Well, I don't know that the agencies have adopted this yet. I know that the CCAA Right-of-Way Habitat Working Group has their own index, but the problem I have with these indexes and with what U.S. Fish and Wildlife is asking is they want to determine the benefit to monarchs by how many stems of milkweed there is. And if you don't have 10 stems per acre, they want you to plant milkweed. And I said, you are going to fail if you ask utilities to start planting anything across right-of-ways to meet a certain thing. You need to manage the vegetation. And I'm also arguing that if we have the pollinator plants coming in that provide the nectar for the adult monarchs to make their migration, that is at least, if not more important than the milkweed for them to lay their eggs on and have their larvae. But we still need to get these things approved by the agencies and adopted by them. And if you've ever tried to do that, it's not the easiest thing in the world. So we're still working on it. But we could use others' help to suggest that to them.
Yeah.